Hello everyone, welcome back to On The Fly. Today we're going to be previewing my trade bait board. We're going to start off from 50, work our way down to 41, and that'll be today's episode. Tomorrow's episode will be 40 to 31. Next day's episode will be from 30 to 21. 20 to 11, and then 10 to 1. So this is going to be a little bit of a series. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up to date with it. And this is going to be, I think, a fun series. I mean, we'll see trades coming down the board, especially as we approach the trade deadline coming up on March 21st. And I think it is going to be a very busy trade deadline. A lot of players have to move. We're sort of approaching that end of year cycle where a lot of these big name players are reaching their UFA status, and especially sort of the younger, more skilled guys are reaching the end of that arbitration year, and especially into that sort of RFA stage. And it is going to be interesting to see what they end up doing, and I am looking forward to seeing what goes on there. But with that, we will jump right on into it with number 50, and this is going to be Nick Leddy. So Nick Leddy does play for Detroit this year. With Detroit, not necessarily a contender, sort of that rebuild team, and he is under contract $5.5 million a year, and he is, after this year, going to become a UFA. So I think Detroit is going to trade him. I don't think it's going to be for very much. Obviously, Leddy is on a very bad contract right now, and I think they can get a little bit of value. Obviously, he brings a lot of leadership, and he comes from the New York Islanders organization, so I am interested to see how they're going to approach that, if they're going to maybe trade him back to New York. But at the end of the day, I think Nick Leddy is a very solid pick. He brings that veteran leadership that a lot of teams, especially coming into that playoff push, are going to need on their team. I do expect him to be traded, especially in that Western Conference where stuff's a little bit more tight. It never hurts to have an extra defenseman there. I also wouldn't be surprised if the Red Wings decide to trade inside their division. They have been known to do that in years past, but at the end of the day, for most teams especially, they are a little bit timid of trading within their division. But I think a team that could really benefit is a team like Boston, a team like the Leafs, where they're sort of looking for that sturdy 6th, 5th defenseman. And I am curious to see what goes on with Nick Leddy, because he is going to be a player to watch. And I think he will be a very underrated type guy for a lot of teams, especially when you take a look at Detroit, who isn't really pressed against the cap right now. When you take a look at it, it makes a lot of sense for them to retain 50%, trade away probably a top 4, an underrated top 4 kind of guy. He'll probably play top 6 minutes on most teams, but he can play top 4 and pretty solid top 4 minutes for you. I think he's going to be a very sneaky pick, which is why I put him at number 50. Because he's not going to get too much value, but he is, in my opinion, likely to be traded. So that's why he's number 50. And moving on to number 49 with Zach Sanford. So this guy, $2 million, going to be a UFA at the end of the year. He plays for Ottawa right now. He was involved in a trade between St. Louis and Ottawa, of course. So with this deal, I think, especially when you look at it, it makes a lot of sense for the Sens to get rid of him. I don't see Sanford playing another year in Ottawa. He is approaching his UFA year, so he's going to look for some money. I don't know if Ottawa's going to want to take the risk on him when they can definitely get probably a 4th round. I expect sort of that 4th, 5th round pick for most of these guys on the list. And others I put on this list, especially higher up, because I don't believe they'll be traded as likely to be traded, but they'll still get some value, and especially as we work our way down. For me, the way I kind of made it was, are they likely to get traded, and are they likely to have value? And I sort of just mixed that. That was sort of the idea behind it, and that's one of the things I'm looking at. So I think with a guy like Sanford, he's sort of not going to have a lot of value, but he is more likely to be traded. And overall, he is that sort of 3rd, 4th line kind of guy, but he's a solid 3rd and 4th kind of guy. He's going to give you really hard minutes, and he's basically going to fight, right? He played with St. Louis, so he has the Cup experience back in 2019, which most teams need. And when you really look at it, it's really a no-lose situation for any team that picks up this guy. Worst case is it's $2 million off the books, and you can live with that. But I am curious to see what happens there, because it's another one of those retaining salary situations. Because Ottawa's going nowhere fast, and especially at the end of the year, they have no reason not to retain salary. They're not going to make any big trades, not going to get a whole bunch of cap, and all of a sudden make a playoff push. So I wouldn't be surprised if they decide to retain 50%, say for $1 million, you can have a pretty solid bottom sixth forward. And I am curious to see what happens with Sanford, and with him, he'll be put number 49 on the list. Moving on to 48 on the list. So speaking of 2019 Stanley Cup runs, we have Marcus Johansen. Of course, he did play with Boston, and he currently plays on Seattle. $1.5 million, going to be UFA at the end of the year. And when we take a look at a guy like Marcus Johansen, he has declined a little bit since his early days, and he isn't necessarily the player he once was. But he is a very solid player, and he's going to bring that sort of leadership role to your team. When you can have sort of that leadership and the ability to play, always a good option. And I think when you really look at a guy like Johansen, you're not going to look for him to put up 40, 50 goals in a season. You're looking more for sort of that just steady production, great defensive playing style, which he has. And I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there once Johansen gets out of Seattle, because I do expect them to trade him. I don't see Johansen coming back. He hasn't shown any interest in coming back to Seattle. So I'm curious to see if Ron Francis decides to make a big move, maybe send a few of his other players, which we do have a few Kraken on the list. So I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there. With him making 48 on the list. We're going to move on to another Seattle Kraken with Jonas Donskoy. So Donskoy, $3.9 million, and he has 1 year left after this year on his contract. So I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on here. It's one of these situations where they don't necessarily need to trade him right now. They have value, so they can keep him for the year after. But it does make sense to trade him right now, especially when you take a look at the value. He has quite a lot of value right now, and especially when you want to hold your chips tight. Obviously, that's a poker reference, but at the end of the day, you want to sort of get players at their highest value, and right now Donskoy has a lot of value just because of the way he's been playing, and you also got to worry about next year. If he gets hurt right before the trade deadline, a lot of teams aren't going to take him, and you might not get anything for him in the end. So I think it is important to take note that right now might be the best time to trade a guy like Jonas Donskoy. I know the Avalanche are obviously a suitable trade contender, obviously, because they picked him up from Colorado. But I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there, because obviously it's another one of these big guys, and I'm looking forward to seeing what goes on there. So with him, he comes in at 47. So 46, Jack Roslovic, Columbus Blue Jackets at 1.8, and he is arbitration RFA eligible. So this is sort of the interesting idea, because Roslovic hasn't had a great year in Columbus. He's better than he was in Winnipeg, of course, but he's not necessarily the top end guy. Like some of the other guys on this list, I wouldn't necessarily consider him a high-end player, but the contract is very team-friendly, and we have a sort of that third, fourth line kind of center role. I do expect a lot of teams to go biting for him, which is once again why I have him at 46 on the list, but I do expect him to have quite a bit of interest. I think when you take a look at the guy, especially on paper-wise, he is going to be an interesting candidate for a lot of teams, and I think when you take a look at it even deeper, there's a lot of teams that actually need a third, fourth line center kind of role, and I do expect him to be shopped around quite a bit. Columbus not necessarily going to need him, especially with arbitration coming. He may or may not take a high pick for his arbitration. He might actually pick reasonably, and I'd say you're looking at probably a $3-ish million contract on his side, and you might argue for $2, and you'll see where the mediator decides to go with that. But I think it's going to be interesting to see where Roslovic ends up, because he is a very solid player. With that, he will come in at 46 on the list. Moving on to number 45 with Calvin Haan coming in at $4.55 million, and he is going to be UFA at the end of the year. So he comes from Chicago. When you take a look at a team like Chicago, they aren't necessarily in a full rebuild yet. They still do have their top-end players like Kane and Taves, but at the same time, they are starting to replace their older guys with newer guys. And I think Haan isn't going to be anything different. I expect Haan to get traded to a team, playoff contending team, because when you take a look at his reputation, it's not necessarily the skill you look at. It's all the cups that he won with Chicago, and I do expect a lot of teams to be biting for that, especially when you take a look at the deep run pushes. You always need sort of that veteran player. Take a look at the Leafs from years past, picking up Jake Muzzin. Obviously not necessarily getting to where they want to be, but you do pick up a very veteran guy who's been there, he's done that, and can help your young team to get there. I think Haan is a very great leader for that. In terms of playing, I do expect him to sort of be that bottom two role. You could argue for sort of that top 4 role, but at the end of the day, I do expect him to be in sort of that 4th, 5th, and 6th defenseman category talks. But with that, he will come in at 45. Number 44 is Josh Manson. He is valued at $4.1 million, and he's going to be UFA at the end of the year. So when we take a look at Manson, this is one of the players who, in my opinion, has a lot of trade value. I don't believe he'll be traded, however. It's just sort of a weird situation when you take a look at Anaheim. They are in a relatively good position in terms of the standings, but they aren't necessarily a high-end contender. They aren't going to be a team that's going to make a deep playoff push this year. So I am looking forward to seeing what they end up doing, because they do have the potential to make a big deal. They got a lot of players who are coming to a UFA status, at least, and we're going to see quite a few big Ducks names in this trade bait board, because they are all coming at the same time, and it is going to be curious to see who they can keep and who they're going to lose, because they also want to make sure that they have money for the future, and I think it is going to be very interesting to see what comes out. And so Manson will come in at 44. Number 43 is going to be Cal Clutterbuck, and he values in at 3.5 million, and he's going to be a UFA at the end of the year, coming from the New York Islanders. So with the Islanders, obviously he has had a very solid performance. This is going to be another team I'm going to remind you are going to see a lot of. The Islanders are in a little bit of a fire sale right now, and all their older guys are starting to come to their year's end. They've had pretty good playoff runs from years past, and I think when you look at sort of that playoff experience portion, a lot of high-value guys, not necessarily the playing style. With Clutterbuck, looking at a third-line forward, nothing really special, but he is going to be that guy who's going to play that tough role. He always has, he always will, and I think it is going to be very interesting to see where Clutterbuck ends up, because he is one of those players where he may get traded for a 7th, he may be traded for a 4th, but at the end of the day, he is a very solid player, and when especially for his role, bringing the leadership, I do expect him to be traded. At the deadline, you could get quite a bit of value for him, and I don't think the Islanders are looking for a playoff spot this year, unfortunately, because when you look at the Eastern standings, especially right now at least, it's basically a 10-point gap. Now, however you look at it, it's a 5-game gap, and it's just unfortunate for a lot of these teams because they're already out of it. They know they're out of it, but they still got to sort of play it through and hope that one of these higher-end teams like a Washington, like a Boston, all of a sudden go on a 5, 10, 15-game losing streak in order to claw their way back into the playoffs. And even if they win every one of their games, there's no guarantee that Boston and Washington will do the same. And it is sort of that bad situation for the Islanders, at least, because they do see themselves not in a playoff spot. They don't see themselves clawing back to a playoff spot. And I don't either. And I think at the end of the day, they are going to be making some big trades at the deadline and probably making their team into a little bit more of that rebuilder stage. But I'm curious to see what ends up happening there, as they are going to be appearing on the trade bait board for quite a while. And then we're going to take a look at the next player, Terry Lehkonen from the Montreal Canadiens, coming at $2.3 million. Arbitration eligible at the end of this year. So with him, I do expect a little bit of action. I'm not sure the Habs necessarily need to trade him. He does fit into that young mold that they are looking for, but I do definitely think he has value right now. And especially for sort of a younger team who's looking for a defenseman, I do expect a lot of teams to be in on him. I don't necessarily see them trading. The Habs, unfortunately, are even worse when it comes to a hot start at the start of the year. But unfortunately, not quite enough for Lehkonen. I don't know if he'll be in a trade. It really is hard to tell, because he's one of those guys where he has the ability to be both. He has the ability to be a prospect. He has the ability to be good right now. So it is interesting to see what the Montreal Canadiens are going to do. I have him at 42, mainly because I don't know if they'll trade him. He has the value to be sort of in that 30-ish range, but at the end of the day, he's not in that top-end tier, and he's not likely to be traded either. So I do expect him to sort of be in that 42 range, just because I don't expect him to be traded. And even if he does get traded, the value is going to be pretty good. But at the end of the day, I think that unlikelihood of being traded outweighs the value that he's going to get in the trade. So with that, we're going to stick him at 42. And the final of this list will be Hampus Lindholm, coming in at $5.2 million, and he's a UFA at the end of the year. And the reason why Hampus Lindholm is so high is mainly because I don't think he'll be traded. I find it very hard to believe you give away your assistant captain, especially right now with the Ducks being a rebuilding team, having a leadership guy in the room, especially a defenseman at that, and who can really play. If I were to base this strictly off skill, he would be at least in the top 20, if not the top 10. And you can make a strong argument for him to be in the top 10, but at the end of the day, I don't expect him to be traded. But I do have to put him on this list because he is nearing the end of his contract, and he is going to be quite a value guy. I'd be surprised to see them trade him, but at the same time, if he is going to be traded, look for that very high value in return. Lindholm could be argued as a top 2 defenseman on any team, but I do expect him on most teams to be that top 4 kind of role. Unless you're looking at a team with a really struggling defensive spot. But with that, this is for number 50 to 41, and this is the current trade bait board. Be sure to check in tomorrow to see the rest of the 40 and the 30 ranges. And with that, if you made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. If you'd like to drop a like, if you really like to consider subscribing, tell all your friends, leave a comment down below your thoughts on the trade bait board 50 to 41. Until next time, see ya.